One of the most amazing things in the Quran, really, to me, is this historical delicacy of the wording and its accuracy.
One of the individuals referred to in the context of Pharaoh is Haman. He is mentioned in 6 different places in the Quran, in which we are informed that he was one of Pharaoh's closest allies. Surprisingly, the name Haman is never mentioned in those sections of the Old Testament pertaining to the life of Prophet Moses.
Is there a mention of a Haman in the Bible? Sure. Is there a mention of Haman building a tower? Sure. But the Haman in the Bible didn't work for Pharaoh. He worked for another king named Xerxes in the biblical book of Esther. So the biblical Catholic scholars in the 1600s, who were first getting into Orientalist studies, Islamic studies, they looked this thing up in the Quran and they said, aha, we found a mistake in the Quran. Look, they're talking about Haman working under Pharaoh, while the book of Esther tells us that Haman worked under the king named Xerxes 1,000 years after the Pharaoh in Babylon, not even in Egypt, and he built them a tower. You ever heard of the story, the Tower of Babylon? So they challenged the historical integrity of the Quran. Ma'adallah, they said, from the disbeliever's point of view, oh, Muhammad must have plagiarized it from a priest and made a mistake because he mixed up the story of the Tower of Babel, right? And the story of Xerxes with the story of the Pharaoh, and he's confused between the two of them. That's what he did. Misquotation in the Quran.
The hieroglyphs, the Egyptian language, was only decoded many, many centuries after. So where did the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ get this knowledge from?
Now check this out. You know Maurice Bucquet, famous Muslim who wrote Bible, Quran, and science? Before he got into that subject, he was a historian. He wanted to study Islamic history. When he came across this problem presented by Catholic priests, he did a little research. You see, what happened in the late 1800s was the Egyptian hieroglyphics were now being revived as a language. So they got into this study. And they made documentations of who the ministers that are mentioned in the documents of the Egyptians, what their roles were, etc., etc. So he travels to Germany to look up the names of different architects and constructors and ministers under the name, under the Pharaoh, specifically under the Pharaoh at the time of historical era of Musa alayhi salam, Moses. What does he find? Haman, minister of the stone quarries, construction. This name is discovered in the 1900s. And this is something they didn't have, but which speaker had? The Messenger of Allah, but actually the speaker is who then? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is just from the historical point of view. Something that they used to laugh at the Muslims came back and blew up in their own face.
Haman was indeed mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. The same inscription also indicated the close relationship between Haman and the Pharaoh. In the Dictionary of People in the New Kingdom, which was prepared based on the entire collection of inscriptions, Haman is said to be the head of stone quarry workers.
كتاب الله في أفيائه شمس الفلاح منيرة دنياك تسمو بروحك للثريا ترتجي أعلى المراتب ساميا بهداك.
The title that's used for the ruler in the story of Yusuf in the Quran is Al-Malik, the king.
Why does the Quran make this differentiation at 2 points in time? The Quran mentions a title for the leader of the Egyptians in 2 ways. In the story of Joseph or Yusuf alayhi salam, the Quran mentions Malik, king, which means ruler, king, or sultan. But in the story of Moses, Musa alayhi salam, the Quran mentions the Pharaoh, or in Arabic, Fir'aun.
So it turns out that the period of time that Joseph came to Egypt was when the Hyksos were ruling. That ruler would not have been called Pharaoh or Fir'aun. By the time they left Egypt with Musa, their memory of the time of Musa, all the details were not very precise, so they backdated, or they applied the term Fir'aun in their stories, which were related by oral history, until they were eventually written down. They called the ruler at the time of Joseph Pharaoh.
The Bible, which was existing at that time, never mentioned king, always mentioned Pharaoh. The Torah never mentioned king, always mentioned Pharaoh.
You know, that's pretty amazing. If Muhammad ﷺ was copying stories that he'd heard from the Jews, then how on earth did he avoid that mistake?
يدعو للعلم وللعمل لا شيء سواه يهذبنا.